Yeah, and welcome to this session with Patrick Carolan. The title of our presentation today is Franciscan Renaissance. Patrick Carolan is a U.S. Catholic activist, organizer, and writer. He served as the executive director of the Franciscan Action Network for 10 years, and he co-founded the Global Catholic Climate Movement and Catholics Vote Common Good. He's currently the co-host of the podcast Tomorrow's American Catholic. Thank you, Patrick, for joining and for telling us more about your thought about the Franciscan Renaissance.
Thank you so much for joining me. And again, my discussion this evening is going to be about it's time for Franciscan Renaissance. Beate shared a little bit about who I am and what I've done. I'll share a little more as I'm going through my talk. The talk is based on an article that I wrote and published with my friend Brian McLaren a couple of years ago. And I'm actually currently writing a book of the same title. It's time for Franciscan Renaissance. Hopefully it'll be out by the summer. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about a Franciscan Renaissance, but I think in order to do that, we first have to have an understanding both of who St. Francis was and what this Franciscan movement that we're talking about is really all about. I mentioned, I wanted to share a little more about myself. I am Catholic. I was raised Catholic. My parents were from Ireland. They came to America as immigrants in 1950. I grew up in a poor Catholic neighborhood, became an activist at an early age. First, protesting, I actually organized a walkout of my high school. And later on, got involved in the labor movement and ended up with the Franciscans. And today I am a podcaster on Tomorrow's American Catholic and a writer. In 2015, I was honored by President Obama for my work on faith and climate. And I'm considered one of the leading Catholic faith justice activists in the U.S. And I know that because I get attacked pretty regularly by far-right Catholic organizations. It's unfortunate. I'm also a seeker, a searcher. I question everything. I remember when I was around 12 years old, I think I was in sixth grade at a Catholic school, and I was being taught by the Good Sisters of Mercy. The lesson was on heaven and hell. And keep in mind, this was shortly after Vatican II. And the sister was explaining to us that if you're good, if you go to church on Sunday, if you pray, if you hold your hands the right way, if you don't commit sin, if you don't die in a state of sin, that when you die, you'll be welcomed to heaven. And you'll be there with God in all of its glory and beauty and joy. But if you do commit a sin, if you die in a state of sin, then you're going to be going to hell, where you'll live in torment forever, for all eternity. I raised my hand and I said, Sister, I'm just trying to understand. If I'm good, I behave myself, I'm an altar boy, I go to Mass on Sundays, I don't commit sin, then when I die, I'll go to heaven and I'll be with God. But if my brother is bad, if he commits sin, if he doesn't go to church, when he dies, he's going to be tormented in hell for all of eternity. My sister looked at me and said, Patrick, that's a good point that you're making. And it's a good question because it's not just about you being good, but you have to also to be a good example for your brother and for those around you so that you can help them get to heaven. So I raised my hand again and I said, Sister, I'm still not understanding it. If I'm in heaven and I'm experiencing all this joy with God while my brother is suffering in hell, how can I be happy knowing my brother that I love dearly is suffering? The sister said, well, Patrick, God gave us what we call free will. And so you have the free will to choose to do good, be the right person. Your brother has that same choice. And if he chooses not to obey the commandments, not to be good, then he'll be punished. He'll go to hell. I raised my hand a third time. And I said, but sister, why he's going to hell is totally irrelevant. What's important is that he's suffering and I am not. And I can't be happy in heaven knowing that my brother, who I love, is suffering and being tormented in hell. Sister replied, well, you'll be so happy in heaven that you'll forget all about your brother. And I said, that won't be me in heaven, sister. I know myself, and I know I can't be happy with my brother suffering. Now, mind you, I was 12 years old. I didn't really have a clue who I was. at which point I got sent to the principal's office. And I think that was the first time of many times that I've been in trouble for acts of nonviolent civil disobedience. So, in talking about its time for Franciscan Renaissance, it leads to a couple of questions. First one is why? Why do we need a Franciscan Renaissance? Second question would be what? What would this Renaissance be about? Then maybe a third question is how? How do we as individuals and all of us together as a society bring about a Franciscan Renaissance? So I'm going to start with the first question. Why do we need a Franciscan Renaissance? To answer that, I have to sort of go back and share a little bit about St. Francis. St. Francis of Assisi, the founder of the Franciscan movement, is considered to be one of our most beloved saints. He's not only beloved in the Catholic world, but in all of Christianity and even in the Muslim world. There are many stories about St. Francis that are circulated in Muslim literature and Muslim stories. But I believe that he's also one of the most misunderstood saints. You know, he's the bird bath saint. So I want you to do something. I want you to think for a moment, to close your eyes maybe, and just think about this for a moment. If you went outside of your house today and you saw this man dressed in rags, roaming around, maybe sitting on a bench talking to the birds, claiming that he had a vision from Jesus hanging on a crucifix in a dilapidated church, talking to him and told him to rebuild his church, what would your first reaction be? Would you just sell everything you had, and give it away and start following him? Most likely you'd be a little fearful of him. Maybe want to stay away. Or maybe you'd want to reach out and help him. Maybe you might see if he needed some food, possibly call the police or call a social worker. But I'm pretty certain you wouldn't just give everything you owned away and follow him. But that's exactly what happened at the time of St. Francis, at the beginning of the Franciscan movement. Today, there's approximately 650,000 Franciscans of all different orders around the globe, and not just Catholic Franciscans. There's an order of Episcopalian Franciscans, there's Lutheran Franciscans, there's evangelical Franciscans, ecumenical Franciscans, and as I said, there are even groups of Muslims who follow St. Francis. And while he is one of the most revered saints, he's also probably one of the most misunderstood. There are thousands and thousands of books written about St. Francis of Assisi, probably more than 1 million articles, talks about him. There's been movies made about him. And yet people really still don't understand who he is or what he believed, what his spirituality was all about. I can probably sum up in one paragraph what people know and believe about St. Francis of Assisi. He was born in 1181 in Assisi. His father was a fairly wealthy merchant cloth dealer. Francis had very little education growing up, just enough so that he could help work in his father's business and hopefully one day run the business. When he was around 18, Francis decided he wanted to make his mark. At that time, there was no Italy, there was just city-states. And Francis's town, Assisi, went to war against the neighboring town of Perugia. So Francis joined, hoping to become a knight. He didn't do too good. As a knight, he fell off his horse on the first day of fighting, was captured. But because he was known that it was the son of a wealthy person, he rode a horse, he had armor, so he was wealthy. His father must have been wealthy, and his father would have been known even in Perugia. As a merchant, he would have done business in Perugia. He often traveled to France to buy clothes and bring it back to sell. And so he would have not only sold it in Assisi, but in all of the surrounding city-states. So Francis was captured, and instead of being killed like they did some of the others, put him in a jail cell for a year to ransom him. He was held in that prison cell in Perugia for about a year until his father could ransom him. After his father ransomed him and brought him home, Francis was a little bit lost. I mean, he spent a year in his jail cell by himself. So today he probably would have been diagnosed with PTSD. He would sometimes just go wandering around in the woods, but he was also helping his father. He was trying to reacclimate himself back into society, but clearly lost. A year or so later, he decided again he wanted to become a knight. So he set out. This time he headed to Rome, where he was going to join the Crusades. Gave his horse away, turned around, and came back home. At this point, he was very lost and took to wandering all the time in the woods. There was a dilapidated church nearby in the woods where he would often go and stay. The Bishop of Assisi, Bishop Guido, was a good friend of his family and knew Francis when he was growing up, so the bishop allowed him to stay in his dilapidated church. And it was here where he had his vision of Christ on the cross telling him to rebuild my church. Francis first thought that what he was talking about was to rebuild the physical church, and he began gathering stones and trying to rebuild the church. He gave everything he owned, and his father disowned him. He would sometimes go into town and preach, but he preached a different gospel than what they were preaching at that time. Now, remember also, at that time, it was prohibited for anyone to preach other than those who were licensed and trained priests, bishops, and deacons. Ordinary people were not allowed to preach. It was considered a crime against the church. But again, the bishop protected Francis and allowed him to preach. Soon others heard him and started following him, and the movement began to grow and grow. First, there were 8 in the first year, and then it grew larger and larger. There was no organization. They didn't write a business plan. They didn't have a mission statement. They didn't have rules and regulations. They only had what Francis believed and understood, his understanding of God and Jesus. And they called themselves the Poor of Assisi. Francis wanted to build a community modeled after the early Christians, the first followers of Jesus that would live together in community and share everything. As more and more followers came, the community grew and grew, and Francis started sending people out in small groups to other parts of the world, first around Assisi and then into France and Spain, and into the Mideast, into Muslim lands, and finally there were thousands and thousands, more than 3,000 after about 7 years. This was also the time of the Crusades, and so Francis made a decision to set out to Damietta in Egypt, where the Crusades were happening. And as the story goes, he was either set out to either become a martyr or to convert to Sultan. I even learned growing up, I was taught that he was actually eventually did convert to Sultan. But he had his encounter with the Sultan, returned home, and a few years later died, leaving the legacy of the Franciscan movement. Now, what most people think of and understand of St. Francis happens every year on the Feast of St. Francis. Every year, all around the globe, churches will have the blessing of the animals. People will bring their pets, their dogs, their cats, even their goldfish. The priest, their minister, will give a blessing. A lot of churches have statues of St. Francis. They'll put them in their church gardens, and all of his statues have the bird on the shoulder. People see and understand Francis as some Dr. Doodle, talk to the animal kind of person without fully understanding the deep spirituality that he gave us. So I want to go back and share a different story of St. Francis now. I mentioned St. Francis's father, but St. Francis was close to his mother. He was very close to his mother. St. Francis's mother was from the Lyon region in France. She probably met St. Francis's father when he was on one of his trips. It's believed that she was born from a wealthy noble family in the Lyon region. During that period when St. Francis's mother was growing up, there was another movement that was growing and expanding throughout the Lyon region. It was called the Waldensians. It was started by Peter Waldo. They were sometimes referred to as the Poor of Lyon. They were originally a Catholic movement who believed the church had been corrupted, empowered by money and power. It needed to go back to the message of Jesus and the life that the first followers of Jesus lived. Peter Waldo was a wealthy merchant who gave everything he owned away to help the poor and the sick. He ran into problems when he preached, because he preached a message challenging the church to focus on caring for the poor rather than accumulating land and wealth. They traveled around wearing rough clothes and sandals. He and many of his followers were excommunicated, and many were actually executed by the church. And though she remained Catholic, Francis's mother would have been familiar with this movement and probably been very sympathetic to it. She would have instilled some of those beliefs about caring for the poor and the sick into Francis as he was growing up. Growing up, Francis would often work at his father's stand selling cloth that his father had brought home. There are stories of him sometimes giving the cloth away and the money, and sometimes some of the money away to the poor. Now, mind you, this was before he had his transformation. He upset his father when he did this. His father would yell at him and call him a fool for giving the money. or some of the money away. One of the other great stories that define St. Francis is his encounter with Sultan al-Kamil. Now, again, the politically correct version of that story is that Francis went to either convert the Sultan or to become a martyr. Shortly after Francis's death, the Pope was trying to raise money and troops for yet another crusade to destroy the Muslims. Francis was already on his way to be canonized. His movement was widely popular. It would not have helped the Pope's chances to have it reported that this revered saint went to the Sultan for peace and opposed the Crusades. So they had to rewrite the story slightly. But during this period, while a Franciscan movement was growing, there was another mystical sect of Islam known as Sufism. It was more and more popular in Muslim worlds. The Sufis believed in the oneness of creation and all creation with God. They taught that the way to God was not through strict adherence to rituals or laws, but rather by understanding that God was everywhere and in every part of creation. It was not considered a type of religious practice, but a life journey. They taught that the way to spiritual enlightenment was to seek a deeper connection with God. They believed that to do this, they had to first detach themselves from all material possessions. Like the Franciscans, Sufis' spiritual ideas promoted love, poverty, humility, and a deep connection to the divine. They believed that they were all images of God, something St. Francis preached later when he talked about becoming a mirror of Christ. In his travels before his meeting with the Sultan, Francis would have encountered and become familiar with Sufis. There was a branch of the Sufi movement which was called the whirling dervishes. The dervishes were often described as ascetics who renounced worldly pursuits and dedicated themselves to the spiritual path. The whirling or spinning ritual was part of a series of rituals that is known as the sima, or listening. In Sufism, it's considered a type of active meditation. In order to forge a deeper connection with Allah, the practice is deep in ritual and meaning. But a simple explanation is that when one had a question to God, they would spin, and when they stopped, they would receive an answer. And there's a story about St. Francis traveling with a companion, Brother Maceo. They came to a crossroad and didn't know which way to go. And Brother Maceo said to Francis, "Which way should we go?" And Francis told them, "We should go in the way that God is directing us." And Maceo said, "Well, how will we know which way God is leading us?" And Francis said, "I want you to spin until I tell you to stop." And so Maceo span, and then Francis told him to stop. And Francis said to him, "Which direction are you facing?" And Maceo replied, "Well, we're facing towards Siena." And Francis said, "Well, that is where God is leading us then." St. Francis at the time had a reputation as a seeker. Twice before he had set out for his encounter with the Sultan, he attempted to travel lands that were controlled by Muslims. Both times, first due to illness and a second to inclement weather, he failed to reach their destination. But interestingly, both of his attempts were to lands that were rich in Sufism. In the book, The Sufis, the Sufi author Idris Shah, who's a 19th century, late 19th, early 20th century author, Idris Shah writes about the history of the Sufis, and he devoted an entire chapter to St. Francis and the Franciscans. He wonders why traditional biographers of St. Francis gloss over his travel intentions. Why was it that in his wandering in Spain, the places he visited were all rich in Sufi culture? Idris Shah provides a compelling circumstantial evidence of Sufi practices and stories showing up in Franciscan tradition. He also writes that in Muslim world, the early Franciscans were often referred to as Sufi Christians. The Sultan Malik al-Kamil, in addition to being the leader of the Muslim army during the Fifth Crusade, was also a very spiritual person. He followed the spirituality of Sufism. He allowed Christians who lived in his territories to freely practice their faith. His own personal doctor was a Coptic Christian. He often would invite mystics of all different faith traditions to come and stay at his. Several occasions, the Sultan offered terms of peace to the Christians during the Crusades. He offered to turn over control of Jerusalem to the Vatican if they would agree to leave Egypt. The Sultan felt that Jerusalem was a sacred place for Christians and it should be in the hands of the Christians. And so he several times offered to turn it back over. But but the Vatican wasn't interested. Cardinal Pelagius was the leader of the Christian armies at that time, and he outright rejected those offers. Pelagius was not interested in regaining control of the sacred sites in Jerusalem, but wanted to just completely wipe out all of the Muslims. Pope Honorius III issued a papal bull describing Muslims as beasts, devils, and contemplative beings. But that's not how St. Francis saw them. The Franciscan movement at this time was the fastest growing community in the Catholic Church. It's estimated that there was more than 5,000 followers of Francis. This was about 8 years into the Franciscan movement. And remember, this is a movement that had no rules or regulations and no business plan. The Sultan, as a person who was interested in learning and welcoming mystics of all different faiths, would have heard about this group of men traveling around dressed in simple robes, preaching a message about the oneness of all creation and God, a message of the power of God, peace, and love. As a spiritual leader, he would have been intrigued by these holy men. It is said that when Francis first met the Sultan, he greeted him with the familiar expression, "May the Lord give you peace." The Sultan was surprised because this is almost identical to the Muslim greeting of peace, "Assalamu alaikum," or "peace be upon you." It says in the Quran that you should respect and honor those who greet you with a message of peace. Say not to those who greet you with peace, "You are not a believer." And when you are greeted with a greeting, greet in return with what is better than it, or at least return it equally, message of peace. We don't know what actually happened at these meetings. We know that Francis was there for about 3 weeks. The Sultan offered him lots of gifts of gold, and Francis only took one gift back with him, and that was a horn, which the Muslims used to call for prayer. That horn still is, if you ever go to Assisi, that horn is still in the chapel of St. Francis in Assisi. But that's the only gift he would take back with him. As Pope Francis wrote in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, Francis did not wage a war of words aimed at imposing doctrines. He simply spread the love of God. He understood that God is love, and those who abide in love abide in God. Unlike church leaders like Pelagius or Pope Honorius III, Francis did not condemn Islam. Rather, Francis spoke of his love and his desire to share the message of Christ. As Father Michael Casado wrote in Healing the Violence of the Contemporary World, a Franciscan paradigm for dialogue with Islam, and he wrote, in order to show by the actions of his own life that the one whom the Church calls the infidel and the enemy par excellence is in fact a brother, a part of the human family, a member of the human fraternity. After their encounter, Francis left and made his way back to Assisi. War broke out again. The Muslim armies under Al-Kamil soundly defeated the Christian armies, and they took thousands of crusaders as prisoners. Now, it would have been a standard practice at that point in time, and it certainly would have been something that the Christian soldiers did, would be to massacre your enemies. If the Christian soldiers had won, they would have massacred all of the Muslims. But Al-Kamil instead ordered his troops to provide food and water to the prisoners and granted them safe passage. When St. Francis returned home, he immediately amended the rules of the Franciscan order to reflect their benevolence on the part of the Sultan. As Paul Moses explains in his book, The Saint and the Sultan, Francis advocated a revolutionary new way for his friars to interact with Muslims. Rather than preach at them, he said, they could just live peacefully among them and even be subject to them. So here he is reaching out not just to the Sultan, but to Muslims in general. Again, that was from Paul Moses' book, which is a great book to read if you want to learn more about that encounter. In a world that is experiencing an intersecting crisis of faith, environment, and social justice, we need a new paradigm. We need a paradigm shift towards a more integrated and holistic praxis. We need to come together in a movement that encompasses ecology, nonviolence, economic inclusivity, and interfaith solidarity. The Jesuit priest, early 20th century Jesuit priest Teilhard de Chardin wrote, "Evolve or be annihilated." He was not talking about the process of physical evolution. He was referring to the evolution of our spirituality. Thomas Berry, late 20th century priest, suggested, and Thomas Berry is also one of the founders of the modern day eco-spirituality movement, and he suggested that we need a new story, one that is not focused on separation and individualism, but on the unity and the interconnectedness of all creation. The prevalent theology during the time of St. Francis was centered around the idea of substitutionary atonement. In this view, the purpose of Jesus' incarnation was to suffer and die as a sacrifice to appease an angry God. But for St. Francis and the Franciscans, Jesus didn't come to appease an angry God. He came to reveal a loving God. This fresh vision of God leads to a fresh vision of everything, everywhere as Christians. As Christians, we created a theology centered around the idea that the incarnation was about sin. Some churches teach that our entire purpose here, every action is important only insofar as it helps us to get to there, wherever there is, heaven. This has led to the reality of ecological devastation, economic disparity. There was a writer, Lynn White, was a cultural historian. I think it was in the 1960s. He wrote an article about the environmental deprivation that was happening, and he blamed it on Christianity. He said it was the fault of the Christian idea of the dominion over. He suggested that we need to go back to what St. Francis taught us. The 13th century Franciscan theologian and philosopher John Duns Scotus, and I don't know if any of you have ever read any of his stuff. And let me just say, if you have read his stuff and you understand it, please let me know and translate it for me, because I've read all of his stuff and I have a hard time understanding anything he says. But he wrote and believed that the incarnation was not plan B. The incarnation was not the original plan. The incarnation was the original plan for creation. It had nothing to do with what we did or did not do. It had nothing to do with us sinning. Prayer that is most frequently prayed by Christians, and the only prayer that Jesus taught us, the Lord's Prayer, it says, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." I often ask people, do you think Jesus came with a building plan or an evacuation plan? Because most of our theology today is centered on an evacuation plan. We're here to get to there. Yet everything Jesus talked about was building the kingdom of heaven here on earth. St. Francis and the Franciscans didn't believe that Jesus came to appease an angry God. As Sister Elia Delio, another great writer, if you know her work, but she wrote in her Franciscan prayer book, prayer begins and ends with the incarnation. It begins with encountering the God of overflowing love in the person of Jesus, and ends with embodying that love in one's own life and becoming a new incarnation. This fresh vision of God leads to a fresh vision of everything, everywhere Christianity. Francis's famous friendship with the wolf and his preaching to the birds are easily reduced to cute little tropes, bird baths, if you will. I have a friend who's a Franciscan friar who told me that he believes his mission is to go around to all the statues of St. Francis in all of the church gardens and knock the birds off, because he said it gives the completely wrong impression of who St. Francis was. But the ecological vision of Francis was about more than bird baths. It was about the interconnectedness of all creation, so that we see every creature as a sister or brother. You know, we know the story of Francis going out and preaching the gospel. And people would ask him, "Why are you preaching the gospel to the birds?" And he said, "God told me to preach the gospel to my brothers and sisters, and these are my brothers and sisters." He considered every part of creation to be his brother and sister. Again, Sister Elia Delia wrote in another book, A Franciscan View of Creation, Francis's respect for creation was not a duty or obligation, but arose out of an inner love by which creation and the source of creation were intimately united. Francis saw himself as a part of creation, as being in relationship with creation, and not having dominion over creation or even stewardship of creation. St. Francis preached a message of peace and nonviolence. It's difficult to preach nonviolence when so much of our religion is focused on the fear of God. Too many Christians today, in fact, for many Christians today, in today's world. Salvation means being saved from an angry God. Carl Jung, one of the greatest 20th, our great 20th century psychologists once said, if our religion is based on salvation, a chief emotion will be fear and trembling. If our religion is based on wonder, our chief emotion will be gratitude. Over the centuries, many forms of Christianity have become religions of fear, but Christianity wasn't always that way. It began as a nonviolent peace movement, a community known for love, a community gathered around a table of fellowship and reconciliation, people armed with the basin and towel of service, not the bomb and gun of violence. Franciscan Renaissance would invite us to become, in the language of St. Clare, nonviolent warriors, not violent warriors, but nonviolent mirrors of Christ for others to see. Father Richard Rohr, another great Franciscan priest, wrote, to grow spiritually, we have to do a lot of unlearning. It's important to remember we have our sacred stories, our gospels, and sometimes, I've heard often, and you've probably heard this too, the priest says this at the beginning of Mass or sometimes at the beginning of the readings, this is the Word of God. And a lot of churches teach us that this is the actual Word of God. It cannot be disputed. It cannot be interpreted any way except what's written down. And I asked the question. There are about 400 different versions of the Gospels of the Bible. So which Bible is the actual Word of God? Because they all contradict each other in places. So which one is the actual Word of God and which one are parts of it maybe or interpretations of it? And just as an example, even within one version of the Gospels, there's contradictions. And, might say these are just trite things, like, for instance, in the story of the loaves and the fishes. In one version, it says there was 4,000 men there. In another version, it says there was 5,000 men there. And we could argue that that's trite. But if God is perfect and God is all-knowing, God couldn't make any mistakes like that. And so what we have in our sacred stories are men's interpretation of the Word of God, not the actual Word of God. And that interpretation goes lots of different ways. We also have to understand that when these sacred stories were being written, they were being written at a time that we had a whole different understanding of the cosmos than we do today. I also find it interesting. A lot of science people will say that spirituality has to catch up to science. And yet, if you look at things like quantum entanglement, which is something Elia Delia writes about, and the whole understanding of quantum entanglement is the same thing that St. Francis and Hildegard talked about when they talked about the interconnectedness of all, of everything. So I always tell my scientist friends that science needs to actually catch up with our spirituality. But Richard Rohr says to grow spiritually, we have to do a lot of unlearning. So let me share a story with you from the Gospels. And again, I want to make it very clear that, to use an old Irish expression, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but we do have to understand that they were written at a time when we had a whole different understanding of the cosmos. So we all know the story of the loaves and the fishes. It's one of the most famous stories in the Gospels. Again, there was either 5,000 or 4,000, depending on which version. But let's think about that story for a second. Jesus is coming. He's gathering lots of followers. He's coming to preach. And people start deciding they're going to go. They're going to come and hear him preach at Galilee. And it says 4,000 or 5,000 men, plus women and children. So there are more than that many there. Now, my wife and I raised 4 children. We didn't go anywhere when our children were younger. We didn't go to church on Sunday. We didn't go for the hour drive to grandma's without packing snacks. Anybody that's a parent understands that if you're taking your child out somewhere, you have to pack snacks. And I remember when my kids were younger and we go to Mass on Sunday, and inevitably they'd end up, one of them at least, or two, would end up in the crying room or the children's room. And either my wife and I would go in with them and we'd have our snacks for them. And there'd be parents there that did forget their snacks. And so we'd all sit around and share snacks. So none of the children went hungry at all. Now let's think about the loaves and the fishes. The men were coming and the women and children were coming. The women more than likely would have said, okay, we'll go, we're going to go hear this guy, but we got to pack a picnic basket. We got to bring snacks. We can't, the kids are going to get hungry. So they would have packed picnic baskets. They would have come with the picnic baskets. The story goes on to say that people were hungry. And so Jesus told the apostles to divide everyone into small groups. I don't remember the number. I think it was 40 or something in a group. And so the apostles divided everybody up into small groups. And then the story goes that Jesus blessed the food and turned the loaves and fishes. But supposing that the miracle wasn't that Jesus, did whatever he did to turn the loaves into fishes, the miracle was that Jesus got all those people together and got them to share their food with each other. And you know what happened when they all shared their food with each other? Nobody went hungry, and there was plenty of food left over. Now, the first story, the way it's told, it's a message of God doing for us. God is doing this for us, or Jesus is doing this for us. In my version of how it's told, it's a story of Jesus teaching us how to do for each other. I kind of like that version a lot better than God doing for us. It's Jesus teaching us this is how we can come together. And just imagine if we took that lesson out of that one reading in one gospel and applied it to today. There would not be a single person going hungry in this world. If we all came together and shared our food and share our resources, nobody would ever have to go hungry. So that's a little different way of looking at the Gospels. And again, they're wonderful, wonderful sacred stories with wonderful messages. But as Richard Rohr said, we have to do a lot of unlearning and reimagining those Gospels. Our world today is suffering in tremendous ways, globally, locally, during this time of increasing divides within the human family and beyond it in terms of the global climate crisis we face. Our world is crying out for us to begin seeing differently. And the Franciscan tradition offers us resources and guidance in responding to that challenge today. The essence of a Franciscan Renaissance is a focus on seeing God in everyone, especially the marginalized, and working toward protecting the integrity of all creation. So I would ask you to just join all of us, come together in your own small communities, and think about being part of a Franciscan Renaissance today. If you want to learn more about that, read Ilia Delia's work, read Richard Rohr's work. Michael Casado's written some great things about it. A number of Franciscan writers have written, talked about it. Look up organizations like the Franciscan Action Network, my old organization, Franciscans International, work at the United Nations. And again, one of the beautiful things about the Franciscan movement is that it's not just a Catholic movement. It's not even just an ecumenical movement. It's an interspiritual movement. And Thomas Berry, again, one time said that we either go forth with a singular spirituality or we'll perish in a desert. And Thomas Berry wasn't talking about whether we celebrate on Friday night or Saturday or Sunday or what words we were using. Thomas Berry was talking about our inner spirituality of how we are connected to all of creation and how we're one with God and with all of creation. So thank you, and peace and all good.
Out there, oh, peace is calling. In the bonds of love we meet. For the world a new day dawning and shine.